The iron scent of blood had been replaced by the sterile sting of antiseptic, but the betrayal felt just as lethal as the hitman's bullet. Joon-ho drifted upward through a fog of morphine, his consciousness snagging on the steady, rhythmic hiss of a ventilator. He tried to shift his weight, to sit up and demand to know who had dared to strike at the dragon of the Seoul underworld, but his body refused to respond. Below his waist, there was only a terrifying, hollow silence, a static void where his strength used to be. His legs were heavy as lead and twice as useless. "He's awake," a voice murmured, but it wasn't the voice of a doctor or his wife. It was a man in a sharp gray suit holding a briefcase like a weapon. Before Joon-ho could even process the physical loss, his wife, Eun-hye, stepped into his line of sight. She didn't offer a hand or a tear. She simply placed a fountain pen on the rolling hospital tray. "The doctors say you'll never walk again, Joon-ho. I can't be the nurse to a broken relic." She didn't wait for his answer. She served the divorce papers right there in the ICU, the ink drying before he could even feel the air in his lungs. The ICU was a sanctuary of glass and silence, or at least it was supposed to be. For Joon-ho, it had become a glass-walled coffin. He stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint, jagged cracks in the plaster, imagining they were maps of the territories he had spent 15 years drowning in blood to conquer. Now those maps were being redrawn by vultures. The door hissed open, and the rhythmic clicking of expensive Italian leather loafers echoed against the linoleum. Joon-ho didn't need to turn his head to know who it was. The scent of expensive oud and overconfidence preceded young Woo, his former lieutenant, the man he had plucked from the gutter and taught how to hold a knife and a balance sheet. "You look small in that bed, Hyung-nim," young Woo said, his voice dripping with a faux sympathy that made Joon-ho's skin crawl. He pulled a chair to the bedside, reversing it to sit astride it, looking down at the paralyzed man with a predatory glint in his eyes. "The word on the street is that the dragon has lost his claws. They're saying you're just a torso now, waiting for the machines to stop humming." Joon-ho tried to speak, but his voice was a ragged rasp, his throat scorched by the tubes that had only recently been removed. "Get out." Young Woo chuckled, reaching into his inner coat pocket to produce a thick manila envelope. He tossed it onto Joon-ho's motionless chest. The weight of the paper felt like a mountain of lead. "I'm here as a friend. A very generous friend. The board is restless, Joon-ho. The family doesn't want a leader who needs a sponge bath. They want stability. They want me." He leaned closer, his shadow eclipsing the harsh fluorescent lights. "Inside that envelope is a buyout offer. It's for 30% of the market value of your holdings. It's a pity price, really. But look at the bright side. It's enough to pay for the best private nursing home in the country. You can spend the rest of your days watching the sunset and letting someone else change your catheters. It's a dignified exit for a man who can no longer stand on his own 2 feet. Joon-ho's fingers twitched, a reflex of phantom rage, but they didn't move. He was a prisoner in his own skin, forced to endure the breath of a traitor on his face. "I built everything," Joon-ho croaked, his eyes burning with a dark, cold fire. "You were nothing. And now I am everything and you are the nothing," young Woo countered, his smile widening into a jagged blade. "Eun-hye has already signed over her proxy shares to me as part of her divorce settlement. She's smart. She knows a sinking ship when she sees one. She didn't want to spend the rest of her youth pushing a wheelchair and smelling like a pharmacy. She's already moved her things into the penthouse, by the way. She says the view is much better without you blocking it." The betrayal cut deeper than the spinal injury. To hear that his wife had not only abandoned him but had handed the keys to his kingdom to his greatest rival was a secondary paralysis. It numbed his heart the way the accident had numbed his nerves. Young Woo stood up, smoothing the creases in his suit. "I'll give you 48 hours to sign those papers, Hyung-nim. After that, The offer drops by half. And don't bother calling the old guard. I've already put them on the payroll. They aren't interested in a boss who can't even kick a dog, let alone run a city. He paused at the door, glancing back one last time. It's a corporate war now, Joon-ho. And you've already lost the ground you're lying on. When the door clicked shut, the silence of the ICU felt heavier than before. Joon-ho stared at the manila envelope resting on his useless legs. He wanted to scream, to tear the paper to shreds, to wrap his hands around Young-woo's throat until the light faded from the younger man's eyes. But he could do nothing. He was a king in a paper crown, presiding over a kingdom of white sheets and 4 bags. He closed his eyes, the darkness behind his eyelids feeling like a welcome grave. For the first time in his life, Joon-ho prayed for the end. He waited for the machines to fail, for his heart to realize that there was no point in beating for a body that couldn't move. He was a dead man who just hadn't stopped breathing yet. The dragon was gone, replaced by a hollow shell, abandoned by his wife, hunted by his brothers, and left to rot in the sterile light of a room that smelled of bleach and failure. He didn't see the woman standing in the doorway, watching him with eyes that had seen their own share of wreckage. He didn't know that his war was only just beginning. Witness the rise of a fallen giant. Read Joon-ho's full journey of grit and grace now. The door to the private suite didn't click open. It was shoved, hitting the stopper with a violent thud that made the monitors spike. Joon-ho didn't bother looking. He expected more lawyers, or perhaps a cleaning crew, to come to scrub away the scent of a dying legacy. You look like a man waiting for a funeral that's already happened. A voice rang out. It was rich, deep, and carried a melodic lilt that Joon-ho didn't recognize. He turned his head slowly. Standing by the door was a woman with skin the color of polished mahogany and eyes that held the sharp, unwavering focus of a sniper. She wore a simple scrub suit, but she carried herself with more authority than the chief of surgery. This was Amara. "I'm not hungry," Joon-ho rasped, eyeing the silver tray she carried. It held a steak dinner sent by one of the few associates still pretending to care, a meal meant for a man who could actually sit up to chew it. Amara didn't answer. She walked to the bedside, looked at the untouched, expensive food, and then looked at the hollowed-out man lying beneath the sheets. Without a word, she picked up the plate and tipped it directly into the wastebasket. The porcelain clattered against the plastic bin. The steak slid into the trash with a wet, unceremonious thud. Joon-ho's eyes widened. "What? What are you doing? Do you have any idea who I am?" "I know exactly who you were," Amara said, pulling up a stool. "You were Joon-ho, the dragon, the man who moved the city like a chess set. But the man I see right now is just a coward using a broken back as an excuse to stop living." "You're fired," he hissed, his face flushing a bruised purple. "Get out before I have you." "Have me what?" she interrupted, leaning in so close he could see the faint scars on her own temple. "Have your men come for me? They're all working for Young-woo now. Have your wife yell at me? She's in Singapore spending your money. You have nobody to call, Joon-ho. You're down to me. And I don't take orders from ghosts." She reached out and gripped his shoulder. Her hand was warm, firm, and entirely devoid of the clinical hesitation he'd grown used to. "The hospital staff, they pity you. They see a tragedy. I see a lazy man. You'd rather die than admit you have to start from zero. You think being a boss means sitting on a throne? No. Right now, being a boss means swallowing your pride and trying to lift a glass of water." "I can't move," Joon-ho roared, his voice cracking. "My spine is severed. My life is over." Amara didn't flinch. She picked up a plastic cup of water with a straw and held it a few inches from his face. She didn't move it toward his lips. She waited. Then die, she said simply. If you've decided it's over, then stop breathing and save us the bill. But if you want to see the look on Young-woo's face when you walk back into that boardroom, you'll reach for this. I told you I can't. Try, she commanded. Stop acting like a mafia king and start acting like a man who wants to live. I don't care about your titles. I don't care about your blood-stained history. To me, you're just another patient who's forgotten that the heart is a muscle, and yours is getting weak from self-pity. For an hour, the room was a battlefield of silence. Joon-ho glared at her, his breathing heavy and ragged. He hated her. He hated her confidence, her strength, and the way she looked at him as if his fears were nothing but shadows. But beneath the hate, a tiny dormant spark of his old ruthlessness flickered. He wasn't used to losing. And this woman was making him lose a psychological war in his own bedroom. Slowly, painfully, Joon-ho began to strain. He couldn't move his arms well, but he used his neck, his jaw, and every ounce of remaining upper body tension to lean forward. Sweat poured down his face. His muscles screamed with phantom pain. Amara didn't move the cup an inch closer. She watched him struggle, her expression unreadable, until finally, his lips brushed the straw. He took a sip. It was the most difficult thing he had ever done. Good, Amara said, setting the cup down. That's the first thing you've taken for yourself since you got here. Tomorrow we do 2 sips. And you're going to look me in the eye when you do it. Joon-ho collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted and trembling. Why are you doing this? Amara stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the city lights Joon-ho used to own. Because people like your wife and your lieutenant think that when a person breaks, they stay broken. They think the unthinkable is that a maid could help a king. But the truly unthinkable thing? That's what happens when a man who has lost everything realizes he finally has nothing left to fear. She turned back to him, her silhouette dark against the glass. Sleep, Joon-ho. Tomorrow, I'm going to make you wish you'd stayed in the accident. Because I'm going to rebuild you, piece by agonizing piece. As she left, Joon-ho didn't look at the ceiling tiles. He looked at the water cup. For the first time since the crash, the dragon didn't want to die. He wanted to kill. But more than that, he wanted to prove the woman in the scrubs wrong. He wanted to show her that he wasn't just a patient. He was still the boss. He just didn't know yet that Amara was the one in charge of his resurrection. The silence that followed Amara's departure was louder than the machines. Joon-ho lay in the dark, his mind racing through the fragments of his old life, the cold steel of a pistol, the smell of rain on Seoul's asphalt, and the way Eun-hye used to look at him with a calculated adoration that he had mistaken for love. He felt like a fallen god, but Amara had treated him like a stubborn child. The next morning, she didn't come in with a tray. She came in with a basin of warm water and a rough towel. She moved with a clinical efficiency that left no room for his modesty or his pride. I can do that myself, Joon-ho snapped as she reached for the hem of his hospital gown. With what hands? She asked, her voice calm but serrated. The ones that couldn't even reach a straw yesterday? Stop fighting the person trying to keep you from smelling like a grave, Joon-ho. He fell silent, his jaw tight as she began to wash his arms. Her touch was different from the nurse's. It wasn't hesitant or overly gentle. It was purposeful. As she worked, she began to talk, not looking at him, but at the task at hand. Everyone thinks their tragedy is the only one in the world, she began. They think their pain is a special kind of lightning that only strikes them. I used to think that too. Joon-ho looked at her. What are you talking about? Amara paused, the washcloth dripping back into the basin. She slowly rolled up her own sleeve, exposing the underside of her forearm. There was a long, jagged scar that looked like a lightning bolt, white against her dark skin. Then she stood and turned her back to him, pulling her collar down just enough to reveal the top of a surgical scar that ran down the center of her spine. 5 years ago, I wasn't a caregiver, she said, turning back to face him. I was a dancer. A good one. I had a fiancé, a man who swore I was his entire world. Then a drunk driver decided a red light was a suggestion. I woke up just like you, dead from the waist down. Joon-ho's breath hitched. He looked at her legs, standing strong and steady beneath her scrubs. You were paralyzed. For 2 years, she said, her eyes distant. And just like you, my world disappeared. My fiancé stayed for 3 weeks. He cried more than I did, but then the crying got tiring. He couldn't handle a woman who couldn't dance, a woman he had to carry to the bathroom. He left a note on the kitchen counter while I was at physical therapy. He took the dog, the savings, and the furniture. I came home to an empty house in a wheelchair I didn't know how to use yet. The air in the room felt thick with a shared, heavy history. For the first time, Joon-ho didn't see a maid or a nurse. He saw a mirror. How did you? He started, but the words felt too small. I realized that being abandoned was a gift, Amara said, her voice turning hard. It meant I didn't have to live up to anyone's expectations of a poor, broken girl. I didn't have anyone to pity me, so I had to stop pitying myself. I had a therapist named Marcus, a man who had lost both legs in a war. He told me that survival is a choice you have to make every single morning. If you don't choose it, you're already dead. They just haven't buried you yet. She leaned over him, her face inches from his. I spent 6 hours a day for 18 months trying to move a single muscle. I screamed until my throat bled. I fell more times than I can count. But I stood up. And then I walked. And then I decided I was going to find the people the world had thrown away and show them how to bite back. Joon-ho looked at the scars she had shown him. They weren't marks of shame. They were medals. You think I can do that? I don't think anything, Amara replied, wringing out the towel. I know that if you don't try, Young-woo wins. If you don't try, Eun-hye gets to tell everyone you were a weak man who collapsed the moment his legs did. Is that the legacy you want? The dragon who became a worm? Joon-ho's eyes flashed with a familiar, dangerous glint. No. Then prove it, she said, tossing the towel into the basin. Today, we don't just drink water. Today, you're going to sit up. Not because a machine pulls you, but because you force your body to obey you again. She moved to the end of the bed and pulled back the sheets, exposing his pale, motionless legs. These aren't dead, Joon-ho. They're just waiting for a leader. Now give them an order. The rest of the morning was a descent into a new kind of hell. Amara didn't help him. She coached him, her voice a constant, rhythmic pressure in his ear. Joon-ho strained until the blood vessels in his eyes felt like they would burst. He gritted his teeth so hard he tasted copper. Every time he slumped back exhausted, she gave him a look of such profound disappointment that he found a reserve of rage he didn't know he had left. By noon, his hospital gown was soaked with sweat. He hadn't managed to sit up fully, but he had cleared the pillow by 3 inches for nearly a minute. It was a pathetic distance for a man who used to run a city, but it felt like climbing Everest. As Amara prepared to leave for her break, she stopped at the door. Marcus told me something once, she said softly. The world breaks everyone, Joon-ho. But afterward, some are strong at the broken places. Think about which one you want to be. When she was gone, Joon-ho didn't look at the television or the clock. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, but they were clenched into fists. For the first time in weeks, the dragon felt the cold, hard weight of a purpose. Amara hadn't just washed his body. She had started to strip away the rot in his soul. The following weeks were a blur of agony and small, quiet victories. The hospital's physical therapy wing became Joon-ho's new underworld, a place where he fought not with silencers and briefcases, but with resistance bands and the sheer weight of his own gravity. Amara was always there, a constant, unrelenting shadow. She had transitioned from his caregiver to his drill sergeant. She didn't allow him the luxury of his wheelchair for more than an hour a day, forcing him to spend the rest of his time on the mats or in the parallel bars, even if he was just hanging there like a piece of dead weight. "Focus, Joon-ho," she commanded, her voice cutting through the heavy humidity of the therapy room. "Stop trying to move the whole leg. You're overthinking it. Your brain is trying to run a marathon when it hasn't even learned to tie its shoes. Find the nerve. Speak to it." Joon-ho was drenched in sweat, his face pressed against the cool vinyl of the mat. He felt humiliated. A week ago, he was the man who decided which ships docked in Incheon. Now, he was a man struggling to convince a single muscle in his right foot to twitch. "I can't feel it, Amara," he groaned, his voice muffled by the mat. "It's like my lower half is made of stone. There's nothing there. It's just empty." Amara knelt beside him. She didn't offer a platitude. She took a small, sharp neurological pin from her kit and pressed it firmly against the base of his big toe. "Do you feel that?" "No." She moved it an inch higher, pressing harder. "How about that?" "Nothing." She didn't stop. She moved with a methodical, almost cruel patience, tracing the paths of his nerves. Joon-ho wanted to roar at her to stop, to let him rest in the numb peace of his failure. But then, as she pressed the pin into a specific point near the arch of his foot, a sensation like a distant, frozen electric shock sparked in the back of his mind. It wasn't pain. It wasn't even a touch. It was a ghostly echo, a flicker of lightning in a dark room. "Wait," Joon-ho whispered, his eyes snapping open. "Do that again." Amara's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed with intensity. She pressed the pin again. "What do you feel?" It's cold. Like a needle made of ice." "That's not the pin, Joon-ho. That's your brain finding a back door," she said, her voice dropping to a low, urgent hum. "The main road is blocked by the trauma, but the side streets are still there. You just have to clear the debris. Now don't look at me. Close your eyes. Imagine that ice spreading. Turn that cold into heat. Command that toe to move." Joon-ho closed his eyes. He blocked out the sound of the other patients, the hum of the air conditioning, and the rhythmic thud of his own heart. He visualized his spine, imagining it not as a shattered pillar but as a series of disconnected wires. He saw the spark. He reached for it with everything he had, every ounce of the ruthlessness that had made him a king, every bit of the rage he felt for Eun-hye, and every shred of the love he was beginning to realize he felt for the woman kneeling beside him. "Move," he commanded. "I am the dragon. I do not stay down." Seconds turned into minutes. The tension in the room was palpable. Amara held her breath, her hand hovering just above his foot. Then it happened. The big toe on his right foot didn't just twitch. It curled downward, a sharp, deliberate movement of perhaps half an inch. Joon-ho let out a sound that was half sob, half rebel yell. He collapsed onto the mat, his lungs burning. "I saw it," Amara whispered, and for the first time a genuine, radiant smile broke across her face. It transformed her features, softening the hardness of her scars. "I saw it, Joon-ho. You're in there. You're coming back." Joon-ho rolled onto his side, looking up at her. His eyes were wet, but they weren't the eyes of a victim anymore. The hollowed-out despair had been replaced by a terrifying, focused clarity. "I moved it," he panted, a dark grin spreading across his lips. "I moved it." "You did," she said, helping him sit up, her hands lingering on his shoulders. "But don't get cocky. A toe isn't a leg. And a leg isn't a man who can defend himself. Young-woo is still out there. Eun-hye is still out there. And they aren't going to wait for you to learn how to dance. Joon-ho reached out and gripped her forearm, his hand surprisingly strong. Let them come. I'm not just learning to walk, Amara. I'm learning how to hunt again. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room shifted. Amara saw the flicker of the man he used to be, the dangerous, calculating leader, but it was tempered by the humility of his struggle. He was no longer just a project or a patient. He was a man starting to realize that his true empire wasn't built on concrete and crime, but on the stubborn refusal to stay broken. Good, Amara said, her voice regaining its steel. Then get back on the bars. You moved a toe. Now I want to see you hold your own weight for 10 seconds. If you can move a muscle, you can build a mountain. Joon-ho didn't complain. He dragged himself toward the parallel bars, his arms shaking but his spirit ignited. The first stand was over. The war for his life had truly begun. The progress Joon-ho had made was fragile, a flickering candle in a hurricane of corporate and legal storms. While he had reclaimed the ability to move his toes and hold his weight for precious seconds, the world outside his hospital room hadn't stopped trying to bury him. The door opened with a soft, familiar click, one that lacked the aggressive thud of Amara or the arrogant stride of Young-woo. Eun-hye stepped into the room, dressed in a white silk suit that screamed of purity and wealth, looking more like an angel than the woman who had signed his life away while he was in a coma. She carried a small bouquet of lilies, their scent cloying and heavy in the small space. Joon-ho, she whispered, her voice trembling with a rehearsed fragility. You look so much better. I've been praying for you every day. Joon-ho sat in his wheelchair, his back straighter than it had been in months. Amara stood in the corner, silent and watchful as a gargoyle. He didn't look at the flowers. He looked at the woman he had once called his wife, searching for a trace of the person he thought he knew. Praying for me or for the ink on the divorce papers to dry faster? Joon-ho asked, his voice cold and steady. Eun-hye flinched, a single, perfect tear tracking down her cheek. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. I was scared, Joon-ho. Seeing you like that, it broke me. I didn't think I was strong enough to watch you suffer. But I've realized I made a mistake. I want to help you. She moved toward him, reaching out as if to take his hand. Amara shifted slightly in the corner, a subtle warning, but Eun-hye ignored her. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. I spoke to the lawyers. If we retract the divorce filing, I can take over your medical care. I can bring you to a private estate. No more sterile rooms, no more staff who don't understand your status. She flicked a dismissive glance toward Amara. We can be a family again. Joon-ho felt the old pull of her presence, the comfort of the familiar. For a split second, the idea of being taken care of felt like a warm blanket. But then he saw it, the slight bulge of a recording device in the pocket of her silk jacket and the way her eyes kept darting to his legs, checking for any sign of life. She wasn't here for a reconciliation. She was here for a peace offering that would double as evidence. If she could catch him on tape sounding confused, desperate, or admitting he couldn't survive without her, it would be the final nail in the coffin for the conservatorship hearing. She needed him to be a broken relic to justify her seizing what remained of his empire. A family, Joon-ho repeated, a dark smile playing on his lips. Is that why you're wearing a wire, Eun-hye? Or is it a digital recorder to capture the sounds of a mentally incompetent husband? Eun-hye froze. The mask of the grieving wife slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing the cold opportunist beneath. She straightened up, the tears drying instantly. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm trying to save you from yourself, Joon-ho. Look at you. You're letting a maid run your life. You're a laughingstock. The only thing I'm letting her do is teach me how to stand so I can look down on people like you, Joon-ho said. Eun-hye scoffed, pulling the recorder from her pocket since the ruse was up. You think a few twitches in your toes make you a man again? Young-woo is already liquidating the logistics arm. The board has already voted. You're a ghost, Joon-ho. I'm just trying to make sure the ghost has a comfortable place to haunt. She leaned in, her voice now a sharp blade. Sign the conservatorship papers voluntarily. If you do, I'll make sure you have the best life care. If you fight me, I'll drag your name through the mud. I'll tell the court about everybody you buried, every hand you broke. I'll make sure the world knows the dragon was always just a monster. I may be a monster, Joon-ho said, his voice rising with a power that made the monitors hum. But I'm a monster that's waking up. Get out, Eun-hye. And take your dead flowers with you. Eun-hye sneered, dropping the lilies on the floor and crushing them under her heel. Fine. Die in this room then. I'll see you in court, where a judge will decide you're nothing but a ward of the state. As the door slammed shut, Joon-ho felt the adrenaline leave his body, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He looked at the crushed lilies on the floor, then at Amara. She's going to use everything, Joon-ho said. The violence, the past, the paralysis. She's going to try to prove I'm not a person anymore. Amara walked over and kicked the flowers aside. She didn't offer him comfort. She offered him a challenge. Then we stop playing in the gym. If she wants to fight for your mind and your body, we give her a war she wasn't prepared for. You're not a boss today, Joon-ho. You're a student. And your first lesson is that a snake's tongue only works if you're close enough to let it bite. She grabbed the handles of his wheelchair and spun him toward the door. No more self-pity. No more peace offerings. From this moment on, every breath you take is a preparation for that courtroom. We're going to the training floor. And you're not coming back until you can't feel your arms. Joon-ho nodded, his hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. The snake had shown her fangs, but she had forgotten one thing. A dragon, even a broken one, never forgets a debt. Let's go, Joon-ho said. I have an empire to reclaim. The transition from the sterile isolation of the ICU to the dedicated rehabilitation wing felt like moving from a tomb to a battlefield. Amara didn't just change the scenery. She changed the stakes. She had secured a private corner of the gym, away from the prying eyes of the public and the paparazzi that Young-woo had undoubtedly hired to document Joon-ho's pathetic state. For Joon-ho, this floor became a sanctuary and a torture chamber. He was no longer the dragon who gave orders from a mahogany desk. He was a student of his own anatomy. Under Amara's guidance, he spent hours strapped into a standing frame, forcing his cardiovascular system to remember how to pump blood against the pull of gravity. The dizziness was a constant companion, a swirling vertigo that threatened to plunge him back into the darkness of the accident. Don't fight the dizziness, Joon-ho, Amara said, her hand steady on the small of his back. Lean into it. Your body is recalibrating. You spent years looking down on people. Now you have to learn how to just look them in the eye again. As the days bled into weeks, the physical therapy evolved. Amara introduced the gauntlet, a series of exercises designed not just for strength, but for the explosive power he would need to prove he wasn't a liability. He worked with heavy ropes, his upper body becoming a symphony of corded muscle, thick and scarred. His chest widened, his shoulders broadened, and his grip became the crushing vice it had been in his youth. But the real work happened in the quiet moments between sets. Amara would sit with him, and they would talk, not about the mafia or the money, but about the philosophy of the warrior. A boss relies on the fear of others, Amara told him one evening as she massaged the cramped muscles of his thighs. A warrior relies on the mastery of himself. Young-woo is a boss. He's fragile because his power is external. If his men leave, he is nothing. But you. We are building a power that no one can take away, even if they take your legs. Joon-ho looked at her, the sweat stinging his eyes. Why do you care so much? You could have just been a nurse. You could have taken the paycheck and let me rot. Amara paused, her fingers digging into the fascia of his leg. Because the world is full of people who think they can discard the broken ones once they've used them up. My fiancé thought he could discard me. Your wife thinks she can discard you. If I let you give up, then they win. And I've decided that I'm done letting people like them win. The metaphor of the training ground extended beyond the physical. Joon-ho began to study the legal documents Amara brought him. The intricacies of conservatorship law, the precedents of mental competency, and the financial trails of his own companies. He was retraining his mind to be as sharp as the knives he used to carry. He learned to control his mafia temper, the hair-trigger rage that Eun-hye hoped to provoke in court to prove he was unstable. One afternoon, during a particularly grueling session on the parallel bars, Joon-ho managed to take 3 independent steps. They weren't graceful. They were heavy, dragging movements that required every ounce of his concentration, but they were his. 3, Amara whispered, counting with him. Don't stop. The 4th one is for Marcus. The 5th one is for every person who called you a ghost. He took the steps. He took 6. By the 7th, his legs buckled and he collapsed. But this time, he didn't wait for Amara to lift him. He used his newly tempered upper body to haul himself back into his chair, his breathing heavy but triumphant. I'm not a boss anymore, Amara, Joon-ho panted, looking up at her with a clarity that was more terrifying than his old anger. I'm a soldier. And soldiers don't just hold territory. They take it back. Good, she said, handing him a towel. Because the court date was just set. 2 weeks, Joon-ho. 2 weeks until you have to prove to the world that the dragon isn't dead. He just changed his scales. The training ground had done its work. The broken relic was gone. In his place was a man who had learned that true power didn't come from the ability to crush others but from the refusal to be crushed himself. As he looked at Amara, Joon-ho realized that she hadn't just given him back his legs. She had given him back his soul. The legal storm that had been brewing in the distance finally made landfall. It arrived in the form of a heavy wax-sealed envelope delivered not to the hospital's reception, but directly into Joon-ho's hands by a process server who looked like he was afraid the man in the wheelchair might still be able to kill him. Joon-ho sat in his darkened room, the document trembling slightly in his grip. It was a petition for a permanent conservatorship. Eun-hye wasn't just asking for a divorce anymore. She was asking a judge to declare him a protected person, a legal shell who could not sign a check, enter a contract, or even decide where he lived. If she won, she would become his legal guardian, effectively owning the dragon as if he were a piece of livestock. She's moving fast, Amara said, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't need to read the papers to know what they were. Young-woo must be feeling the pressure. He needs your shares to finalize the merger with the Japanese conglomerates, and he can't get them as long as you're legally autonomous. If I lose this, Joon-ho said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, I'll spend the rest of my life in a facility of her choosing. She'll sedate me into a stupor while they strip mine my life's work. Then we don't lose, Amara replied, walking over to snatch the papers from his lap. She skimmed the clinical language, terms like diminished cognitive capacity and physical inability to maintain self-care. They're basing their entire argument on your emotional instability and the fact that you haven't been seen in public. They want to paint a picture of a broken man rotting in a hospital bed, losing his mind to bitterness. The reality of the trap was suffocating. To win, Joon-ho couldn't just be better. He had to be impeccable. He had to face a court-appointed evaluator, a psychiatrist who would poke and prod at his trauma, looking for the legendary mafia temper that would prove he was a danger to himself or others. One slip, one outburst of the old Joon-ho, and the cage would lock forever. The hearing is in 10 days, Joon-ho noted, his jaw tightening. They've scheduled a mental competency evaluation for Monday. Eun-hye's lawyers will be there. They'll try to provoke me, Amara. They know exactly which buttons to press. Let them press them, Amara said, her eyes flashing with a fierce, protective light. We're going to spend the next 72 hours in psychological warfare training. You've learned how to make your muscles obey you. Now you have to learn how to make your ego obey you. You have to be the calmest man in that room while they call you a monster. That night, the physical training stopped, and the mental siege began. Amara played the role of the opposing counsel, hurling insults at him, mocking his paralysis, and bringing up the names of men he had hurt in his past. Joon-ho sat in the center of the room, his hands gripped so tightly on the armrests of his chair that the leather groaned, forcing himself to breathe through the red mist that threatened to cloud his vision. "You're a cripple, Joon-ho," she spat, pacing around him like a predator. "You're a thug who got lucky, and now the luck has run out. Your wife is sleeping in your bed with your rival, and you're here, leaking on yourself. Tell me, does it burn? Does it make you want to wrap your hands around her throat?" Joon-ho's breath was ragged. His pulse hammered in his ears. The old instinct, to strike, to crush, to dominate, screamed for release. But then he looked at Amara. He saw the scars on her arm, the medals of a woman who had survived a different kind of war. He remembered the feeling of his toe curling for the first time. "My wife is a stranger to me," Joon-ho said, his voice coming out like smooth, cold glass. "And my rivals are merely shadows I haven't stepped on yet. My physical state is a temporary condition. My mind, however, is quite occupied with the future." Amara stopped pacing. A slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. "Better. Much better. But on Monday, they won't be using words. They'll be using your medical records and the testimony of the men you used to lead. They want to show that the dragon is a beast that needs to be caged." "Then let them bring the cage," Joon-ho said, staring at his reflection in the dark window. He looked leaner, harder, and more focused than the man who had entered this hospital. "They think they're trapping a dying animal. They don't realize they're locking themselves in a room with a man who has nothing left to lose." As the weekend faded into the cold light of Monday morning, the atmosphere in the hospital changed. The conservatorship trap was set. Joon-ho dressed in a tailored black suit, the jacket expertly pinned to hide the lean of his torso. He sat in his chair, not as a patient, but as a man preparing for a summit. Before they left for the evaluation room, Amara leaned down and adjusted his tie. "Remember," she whispered, "they want the monster. Give them the king." Joon-ho nodded, the weight of the moment settling on him like armor. He wasn't just fighting for his bank accounts or his company. He was fighting for the right to be a man. And as he rolled toward the elevators, the dragon felt something he hadn't felt in years, a cold, terrifying sense of peace. The evaluation room was a theater of sterile aggression. Joon-ho sat at the head of a long mahogany table, flanked by his legal team and Amara, who sat just behind him, a silent anchor in a room full of sharks. Opposite him sat the court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Eris, and Eun-hye's lead attorney, a man whose smile never reached his predatory eyes. "Mr. Joon-ho," Dr. Eris began, clicking his pen with a rhythmic, irritating sound. "We are here to determine if you possess the cognitive and emotional stability to manage your own affairs. Given your history in unconventional business circles and the severe trauma of your accident, there are concerns about your impulse control." "My business history is a matter of public record," And my accident is a matter of medical record, Joon-ho replied, his voice a calm, measured baritone. Neither of those things dictates my future capacity to think for myself. The attorney smirked, sliding a folder across the table. Is that so? Because we have reports from your time in the ICU. Reports of you being combative, verbally abusive, and clinically depressed. You even threatened the hospital staff, didn't you? Joon-ho felt the familiar heat rising in his chest. He remembered the night he had screamed at the nurses, the night he had wanted to burn the world down because he couldn't feel his feet. He looked at the attorney, seeing the trap wide open. They wanted him to explode. They wanted him to prove that he was still the violent boss who solved problems with his fists. He felt a light, firm pressure on the back of his shoulder. Amara's hand. It was a grounding wire. I was a man who had lost his life as he knew it, Joon-ho said, refusing to look at the lawyer, keeping his gaze locked on the psychiatrist. Anger is a natural stage of grief. If I hadn't been angry, doctor, you would be diagnosing me with catatonia. I am no longer in the ICU. I am in the recovery phase. And my impulses are now directed toward a singular goal, rebuilding. And what about your relationship with this caregiver? The lawyer pushed, gesturing dismissively toward Amara. We find it suspicious that a man of your stature has abandoned his professional medical team for a woman with no formal nursing degree in this country. A woman who, we discovered, has a history of similar trauma. Are you sure you aren't suffering from a dependency disorder? Is she your nurse or your crutch? The room went cold. Joon-ho saw Amara flinch almost imperceptibly at the mention of her past. The lawyer was digging into her scars to get to him. It was a low blow, even for a man who represented the underworld. Joon-ho leaned forward, his upper body movement fluid and controlled. She is the only person in the city who didn't look at me like a bank account or a corpse. If you want to talk about dependency, let's talk about my wife, who cannot seem to survive without the assets I built with my own hands. Amara didn't give me a crutch. She gave me a mirror. She showed me that a man is defined by what he does when he's down, not when he's on top. Dr. Eris scribbled notes furiously. The evaluation continued for 4 grueling hours. They brought up the hit that caused the accident, hinting that Joon-ho's enemies would come for him again and that he was too weak to protect himself or his estate. They played recordings of his past associates claiming he was unstable. They tried to tire him out, hoping that physical exhaustion would break his mental resolve. But Joon-ho was a man who had been forged in the fire of Amara's training. He used the breathing techniques she had taught him. He visualized his goals. He treated every question like a physical therapy rep, straining, but never breaking. One final question, Dr. Eris said, looking up from his notes. The petition claims that your paralysis has rendered you spiritually and mentally broken. Do you feel broken, Mr. Joon-ho? Joon-ho looked down at his hands, then out at the window where the Seoul skyline glittered. He thought about the man who had woken up in the ICU, wanting to die. Then he thought about the man who had moved his toe 10 days ago. A sword is broken when it snaps, Joon-ho said slowly. But steel is only strengthened when it is beaten and folded in the forge. My legs do not work the way they used to, but my mind has never been clearer. I am not broken. I am being refined. The psychiatrist was silent for a long moment. He looked at the lawyer, then back at Joon-ho. Thank you. That will be all for today. As they rolled out of the room, the silence between Joon-ho and Amara was charged with an electric relief. They hadn't won yet, but the monster they expected had never shown up. You stayed in the light, Amara whispered as they reached the elevator. You didn't let them drag you into the mud. I couldn't, Joon-ho said, looking at her. I had to show them that the dragon doesn't need to breathe fire to be heard. Now there's only one thing left. The courtroom, Amara said. No, Joon-ho corrected. The walk. Will Joon-ho choose revenge or redemption? Subscribe and hit the bell to see the final showdown in the courtroom. The morning of the final hearing didn't feel like a funeral. It felt like a coronation. The courthouse was swarmed with reporters, their lenses trained on the black sedan as it pulled up to the curb. Inside the car, Joon-ho sat perfectly still. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his hair swept back, his eyes fixed on the towering columns of the Hall of Justice. Beside him, Amara reached out and took his hand. Her grip was steady, a silent reminder of every hour spent on the mats and every tear shed in the dark. This is it, she whispered. The world thinks you're going to roll in there. Let's show them what a dragon looks like when he decides to fly. The courtroom was packed. Eun-hye sat at the petitioner's table, looking radiant in a somber navy dress, flanked by young Woo, who sat in the gallery like a king in waiting. When the bailiff announced the case, the room fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Mr. Joon-ho, the judge began, peering over her spectacles. The court has reviewed the psychiatric evaluations and the medical reports. However, the petitioner argues that your physical state renders you unable to perform the basic duties of your office or care for your estate. Do you have anything to say before I make my ruling? Joon-ho's attorney stood, but Joon-ho raised a hand, silencing him. He looked at Amara, who gave him a single sharp nod. Then the unthinkable happened. Joon-ho didn't speak from his chair. He reached out and gripped the arms of his wheelchair. His knuckles turned white. The room held its breath. With a low guttural growl of effort that vibrated in the floorboards, Joon-ho began to rise. Eun-hye's jaw dropped. Young Woo leaned forward, his smug expression shattering into a mask of pure shock. Joon-ho's legs trembled violently. The muscles, rebuilt through months of Amara's unthinkable training, groaned under the weight. But he didn't fall. He stood upright, towering over the table, his height as intimidating as it had been the day he took over the city. He didn't just stand for a second. He stood for a minute, then 2, then 5. I am Joon-ho, he said, his voice echoing through the chamber with the force of a thunderclap. I have been betrayed by my blood and abandoned by my wife. I have been left for dead in a world that values power over humanity. But I am standing. And as long as I can stand, no one, not this court, not that woman, and certainly not that traitor, will tell me what I am worth. The judge's gavel didn't just end the hearing. It shattered Eun-hye's future. The petition for conservatorship was denied. The divorce was finalized on Joon-ho's terms. Weeks later, the dragon made one final executive decision. He liquidated the majority of his underworld holdings, turning the illicit empire into a legal, transparent foundation. He used the capital to build the Amara and Marcus Rehabilitation Center, a state-of-the-art facility dedicated to those the world had discarded. The story ended not in a boardroom, but in the garden of that center. Joon-ho stood at the altar, his legs supported by a discreet brace, but his weight held up by his own strength. He didn't look at the city he used to rule. He looked at Amara, who walked toward him in a dress that glowed like sunlight. He stood for 12 minutes during the ceremony, the longest he had ever stood since the accident. As he took his vows, he realized that he hadn't lost his legs. He had traded them for a soul. He had lost a kingdom of shadows to gain a life of light. Joon-ho, the man he was becoming, kissed his wife softly. They stood together, watching the city lights flicker to life. Two people who'd been broken and had rebuilt themselves stronger. Not perfect, not unmarred by scars, but whole in the ways that mattered. If the world left you for dead, who would you want by your side? Tell us your thoughts on Amara's tough love in the comments.